Thanks so much to all of you who took the time to message me after the last video. Most of you wanted to start writing your stories as soon as possible, so let me give you a quick overview of the videos I've planned so far before we start. Welcome back to Flourish Books. I'm Angelina. So last week you already saw that I have a bunch of videos planned out for us because we want to work in baby steps and write our books together that way. But you're probably wondering what all these steps are and how long it'll take us to actually write our stories. So let me give you an overview. So as I'm uploading this video, I've already covered 2 of the planned videos. Last week was an introductory video and today is for giving you an overview. That way you know exactly what kinds of topics we're going to cover within the next couple of months. But as you may have noticed, not all of the videos include a call to action or a task. Some of the videos are purely informational. Because I've worked on so many stories before, and the most complex one being my very first attempt to write a book, but I put it aside because it turned out really cliche because I was missing a lot of info on writing up front, so I want to make sure you won't have the same problem. That's why the next couple of videos will be just for your information and also so we can share these videos and gather more people, because the more people join in, the higher the chances you will find other people writing in your genre or category. And I think this would be awesome because that's why I'm sharing all of this, so we can work together and motivate each other. And what better way to do it than with people who also write in our genre. Okay, so next week I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of outlining and also what different types of outlines there are, because you don't have to work exactly on each task that I give you. All I want to do is give you inspiration and information so you can make the best out of your story. Next, I'm going to give you some ideas on how to prepare yourself for writing, but it doesn't include the story that you're about to write, but more like things you can do to improve your writing style and voice and simply to prepare. The following video, I'll be talking about the basic principles of storytelling, the kinds of basics you can apply to all sorts of writing. Then there will be videos specifically on applying these to different categories. I'll be focusing on novel writing here because that's what I do. But the same steps can also be applied to nonfiction and short fiction and screenwriting and gameplay writing. But I'm going to explain that when the time comes. And then we're going to start with the idea finding phase. So even if you don't have an idea for your story yet, I'm going to give you some examples for how to find an idea that excites you. And then we'll already talk about discovering the theme of your story, because it's incredibly helpful to know upfront what you want to say with your story. And this is important no matter how superficial your first idea might seem. Then I guess having an idea and hopefully a theme is probably going to already give you a bunch of ideas on how your story might go down. And therefore I'm going to talk about writing a series about how to make the decision to expand the story further, pros and cons, and if you decide to write a series, then how you should proceed from there, because this process is technically designed for writing standalones. But I myself am going to write a series, so I'll explain how I'm going to apply this process for writing my series, and hopefully they'll help you. Next, we're going to define the genre and category of your story, because they all have certain requirements, which might give you more ideas or might help discard some unfitting ideas. And then there will be a short video on how and when to do research for your story, and also on how you muse. We're going to talk about that too. And then we're going to talk about story structure. And I don't mean storytelling basics as mentioned before, but how to give your story a structure so it'll appeal to readers in the best way possible. And of course, we need a protagonist for our story. You will probably already have thought of one by then. So in the following video, I'm going to give some advice on what kinds of things you should know about him or her, because the story lives and dies with the lead character. So we need to know everything about them, and that's why there will be 2 videos on that topic. And since the main character is the one propelling a plot forward, this will probably give us even more ideas on what's going to happen to him or her. So if you haven't thought of a theme by then, I'll give you an additional video on how to find a theme from there. Then, if you know your theme, you probably know what your main character will have to learn during your story, because every story should be about something. Even in comedies, romance, and horror, there should be a lesson your main character learns, or you risk your story being bland or superficial, and yeah, likely not to stay in your readers' heads. And we want them to remember our stories, right? So if we know our theme, a lesson your protagonist learns, we have to identify whether we're thinking of a change itself or of the result of your main character changing or learning that lesson. So in that video, we'll identify whether your idea is a midpoint or a climax, and how to create your story from these points. And since we now know what the main problem in our story is, we can create a villain as well. I'm going to talk about the difference between a villain and an antagonist, and also on creating a villain that doesn't necessarily have to be a real person, but some kind of force that represents the counter theme of your story, something that holds your protagonist back. Once we know our theme, our protagonist, our villain, and therefore main conflict, we can create a premise, or also referred to as elevator pitch. It is basically a one-sentence summary of your story that helps you stay in focus, but also helps if later someone asks what your story is about. But I'm going to explain that when we're there. The video after that will be about creating side characters, because they're just as important to move the plot forward, because they interact with your main character, give them information, and so on. And next, we will be talking about world building, one of my favorite topics, because your story must be set somewhere, and the setting should be more than just a backdrop. Of course, science fiction and fantasy writers will have a lot of work to do here, but also historical fiction writers, as well as everyone else, including romance writers and thriller writers, and etc. You might not have to invent entirely new political systems or new species or anything, but there are plenty other things you might find in your setting that can give you information, or give information to the reader, or create obstacles for your protagonist, and so on. Which brings me to the next video. I'm going to give some help on coming up with additional obstacles for your protagonist. These can include the setting, laws, societal rules, whatever you come up with. You will have a long list of obstacles to throw in your protagonist's path, and therefore we need to get them into some sort of order. So we're going to identify the big plot points according to the 3-act structure. And now that we have a better understanding of what our story will be, we can think about writing a 1-page synopsis. This will be absolutely helpful for later, because a lot of publishers want to see a synopsis when you submit your story, and it'll be harder to summarize your book in 1 page when you already know every detail, so it's easier to do it now without all that knowledge. And then we're going to define who is telling the story to who, or whom. Let me know in the comments, I'm not sure. Because this may influence the entire view on what's happening. I'm not only talking about point of view, like first person or third person omniscient, but also the tense and the actual perspective. Like, maybe you know The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, which was narrated from the perspective of death, which was really creative. But it can also be written in journal form, or someone reflecting on his life story from behind the grave. But all these possibilities can affect not only the point of view and the tense, but also the plot itself. So, very important. And since we're talking about tense, I'm also going to talk about flashbacks and how to use them correctly, or when to avoid them entirely. And then the next video will be on creating tension and various aspects of how you can create it, or basically just make the reader care enough and keep turning the pages. And the last step before creating an actual scene list will be to write a long synopsis, if that's what you'd like to do. Randy Ingram Manson, the creator of the Snowflake method, says to make it a 4-page synopsis. Others even say that it can be as much as a 50-page summary, including every detail and twist you've come up with. But that'll be entirely up to you. I personally love working with detailed scene lists with defined goals and conflicts for each scene. So that's what I'm going to talk about in detail in the following videos. I'm going to give you a thorough explanation of what a scene should include, what the difference between action and reaction is, if that's what you want to call it. And we're going to talk about scenes with no apparent action, or at least scenes that don't move the plot forward, like unfortunately a lot of sex scenes and violence scenes. And we're going to talk about how to fix that. And then I'll give you a detailed explanation on show don't tell, which I'm sure you have heard of, because some things you show might actually influence the plot instead of just being a fancier way of communicating an emotion in the character. So these might be included as complete scenes. You will already have a bunch of scenes to go into your story by then, and then we have to put them in the right order and fill in the blanks. So we'll be working a bit chronologically there, and I'll give you some insight on how to create a decent hook, the introduction of your story to the reader, and then we'll talk about the inciting incident, the most significant disturbance in your protagonist's former life, or the catalyst for your story. Then we'll talk about the transition from Act 1 to Act 2, a game changer, if you will. Remember, we've probably already defined these events. We're talking about scene structure here to get the best out of these moments. And then during the first half of Act 2, we're giving our protagonist the horror of having to unavoidably try to adapt to all the new circumstances and, yeah, mostly failing. Because this is the reactive phase, because your protagonist is trying to figure out what's going on. Then follows the midpoint. Some say it's a kind of mirror point to your story, the moment when your main character sees the way he's been living before, and now here's this big change and a big piece of information that'll propel him or her to go from reaction to proaction. But I'm going to explain this further when the time comes. So then follows the proactive phase, a trial and error phase, because your protagonist is trying to figure out how to defeat the villain of your story, which results in ultimately, failing in an all is lost moment at the end of Act 2. And this will set apart the action in Act 2 from the action that'll follow leading up to the climax. And after that, I'm going to give you some info on classic villain speeches, and then I'm going to talk about coming up with a fitting conclusion to your story. If anyone gets stuck on the way, I'm going to try to help you get unstuck. And we'll also talk about plot twists, how they mostly work, and how to include them into your scene list. And then again, I'm going to talk about writing a series, because you'll be likely to only have outlined your first book, so I'd like to give you some insight on into my process, and I hope that'll help you. I'm also going to talk about info dumping, how to avoid it, and instead include details into your scene list and in more digestible chunks. And one video will be about symbolism, one will be specifically on how to include purely emotional moments in your scenes. And then, since by then you more or less know what's going to happen in your story, we're going to revise the hook of your story and check if it's still the best way to introduce the reader to your story. In the last video, before we actually start writing our first draft, I want you to write your own 5-star review. So you have a very clear idea of what kind of feelings you want to evoke in the reader of your story. So, and then we're going to start writing. So we know what our stories are about. We know where our characters are going. All we have to do is put everything into cohesive sentences and punch out a decent first draft. And we're going to start together and hopefully finish together, and during that time I'm going to upload more videos, but they'll be mostly motivational, and I have one to simply tell everyone to start writing, then I'll tell you not to revise anything until you're done, and I'm going to talk about overwriting and underwriting, and about killing any doubts that might arise during the writing phase. Then I'll already be covering some topics that actually belong more in the revision phase, but they're actually also good to know beforehand, like on writing style / voice, on describing details, on writing dialogue, on describing locations and how to convey emotions effectively. Once we're done writing, we're going to revise and edit our stories together, and I don't have the videos all planned out yet. I've only included what I learned from short fiction editing so far, but I still want to work through these 2 books and some articles I've saved, so I'm definitely going to add a lot more videos for that stage. Yeah, just so you know. And once we clean up our manuscripts after professional edits and everything, we're probably also going to talk about different ways to publish a book and how to market it, because these days even traditional publishers want to know that an author is engaged in driving up the sales, and that's just the way it is. So we need to know about marketing as well. I know this looks like a lot of work, and it is, and that's why we're going in small baby steps and hopefully be motivating each other on the way. And I really hope you don't feel overwhelmed by this outlining process, but figuring out what your story is about before actually writing it saves you a lot of time later during the edits. But I'm going to talk about the benefits of an outline in my next video, so make sure to subscribe and hit the little bell icon to be notified for that. And yep, until then, have a great week. Bye!